It was right around the time of the month where it was time for us to pay rent. And looking back, it was an awesome apartment. It was super cheap. But at the time, I just had no money. And I just could not stand the idea of paying rent when I didn't have a lot of money for that. And so it just kind of dawned on me, well, what if I tried to buy my own two-family, rent out part of it, live there? Maybe that would make things a little bit easier and cover the mortgage.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Freedom Blueprint. I'm Adrienne Green and today we are here with Alex Steeg. Alex, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here with you.
I can't wait for Alex to share all of his wisdom, so get ready guys. He's going to have insights that are going to help you scale, systemize, and create more freedom. His life has been transformed through his investing over the last few years, and he's going to share it all with us. So to give you a little bit of a background or big picture, Alex is a short-term rental investor himself. He helps co-host for other short-term rental owners, and so he has a lot of experience dealing with all of that fun of short-term rentals. And then he also uses that experience to help coach people who may want to self-manage their properties and pass along his wisdom in that way. So you do a lot right now, Alex, but let's start at the beginning. How did you get involved in real estate investing in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's an interesting story. It goes back to 2019. My wife and I had been married for about 2 years. I think I was 25 at the time, and I was in grad school. And I was at my apartment. My wife was working in a nonprofit. I was in grad school. We just didn't have a lot of money. And it was right around the time of the month where it was time for us to pay rent. And looking back, it was an awesome apartment. It was super cheap. But at the time, I just had no money. And I just could not stand the idea of paying rent when I didn't have a lot of money for that. And so it just kind of dawned on me, well, what if I tried to buy my own two-family, rent out part of it, live there? Maybe that would make things a little bit easier and cover the mortgage. And it also coincided where I had about a year left in my master's program, and I was trying to figure out what I was doing. I was in seminary, so I was looking at potentially working at a church, and I just didn't really want to do that towards the end of my time. And so I started reaching out, started thinking about some ideas of what I could do for work. And where I ended up landing was working back at the college. To fast forward a couple months, I ended up working back at the college that my wife and I had met at, where I became a resident director, so we had free housing. Now, right before that, so I kind of had this idea that, in this last year of my master's program, this was the direction that I was going to head. And I really kind of put us into high gear of we need to find something before we move onto campus so that we can live there for a couple months, get some tenants in there. And then when we move out, we can replace ourselves with a new set of tenants. And so it was really tough to find a two-family. I'm in a little bit of a higher priced market. I'm north of Boston, and it was tough. We had low income, and so it was hard to find something. We scraped together every penny that we had. We took advantage of that town that I bought in, Gloucester, Massachusetts. They had a first-time home buyer, $10,000, 0% loan for first-time home buyers, so we took advantage of that. And like I said, we bootstrapped everything. I don't advise this, but we lived off of 0% credit cards for the first 3-4 months after we purchased, because we spent every penny that we had to get into this property. But we found tenants. They moved in literally I think it was 3 days after we closed. The tenants moved in. I knew them from just being in this area, and they stayed with me for a couple years. The plan worked out perfectly. I got the job. We moved on to campus. I rented the house out. And that is when we started getting the cash flow from that property. That's when I really started to see that this could work for us. And we had no living expenses. And so that just kind of ballooned into buying another property in 2020, buying another property another two-family in 2021. And then that's kind of where things shifted for my wife and I, where we started to pivot into the short-term rental space. We had been totally bought into the long-term rental traditional mentality up until then. And it wasn't until my wife found out that she was expecting with our first son that she then needed a little bit of a job transition for herself as well. She was wrapping up her time with a nonprofit. She had about 8 months until my son was born, and she ended up getting connected to an individual who part of her job was to manage his real estate portfolio. Some of it being long-term, some of it being short-term. And in that process of learning how to manage his short-terms and this kind of natural transition point when they kind of parted ways, it was an obvious thing where, hey, we love real estate. It's been good to us. You have this niche expertise now of short-term rentals, and we live in a very traditional vacation rental market. And so it kind of was a no-brainer for us to start the Airbnb management company that we have back in March, April of 2022. And so since then, that has really exploded for us. We manage about 40 properties. That has then also pivoted, now that we have this kind of expertise, understanding this knowledge of short-term rentals, that has pivoted us into, back in December, I bought a 10-unit inn that we are operating as an inn. It's my thesis behind that is that you can apply a lot of the same systems, operations from short-term rentals over into more of this commercial real estate, hospitality side of things, the valuations of that. We can talk about commercial real estate another time, but because of the way that those things get valued, it seemed like a no-brainer for us to kind of try and make that pivot with what we've learned over the last couple of years.
Wow. I love that whole history. We started from, just that anger, right? And I think, that realizing the value of a dollar when you don't have a ton of them, right? Mm-hmm. As a major motivation. And the funny thing is, starting at the beginning, you're like, okay, I had this idea, but then I was going to be effectively like a resident advisor, right? An RA with free housing kind of thing.
Basically.
A lot of people would just take that as the easy button and not keep pursuing that house purchase. But you did not. You chose the hard path, even when that meant like living on credit cards. I'm curious, what was your mindset or your mentality of like choosing that hard path there? Like, how did you and your wife make that tough decision and stick with it even when it wasn't easy?
Yes, that's a great question. I have to give my wife a lot of credit. I know what my finances looked like before I got married, and I know what they looked like immediately after we got married. And I credit a lot of what we have to her with the discipline that she had with her finances from day one, right after she graduated and paid off a lot of student loans on a very quick time frame while working at a nonprofit with low income. And I really credit a lot of that to just her discipline to do that. And so when we then started looking and getting into real estate, we just applied a lot of those same lessons that she had learned, those disciplines that she had acquired over those years into this space where it was, hey, we're not going to touch the cash flow. We're going to just reinvest that back in. Or, yeah, we have this extra money that's coming back in, but we're not going to allow lifestyle creep to get us where even if we're, increasing our standard of living a little bit, we're not going to allow ourselves to do that. We're going to play the long game here and enjoy the fruits of our labor later on in life. And I also think too, like being able to look at where you are in life, like this was in our mid-20s, right? We had no kids. We were able to put our heads down and just grind it out for a little while. I think if I were to start all over I have 2 kids right now, I have a third on the way. Like if I were to start this now, that would have made things much more difficult. And I do attribute a lot of it to, being able to get in and start doing real estate at what felt like a hard barrier at the time. But now I'm like, it was actually a very good time for me to start with real estate. So part of it's skill, discipline. Some of it was just good timing, I think.
Well, I think that you give too much credit to the timing, because I think from an outside perspective, a lot of people would say when you've got the low income, when you're still in school, when you've got these things like easy housing, tons of people could use those as reasons to not get started as real estate. So I think give yourself a little more of a pat on the back, and
sure.
You give a lot of credit to your wife too, because it's never easy. You can always find challenges or reasons not to do it. So great for you guys for getting started when you did.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's been a good journey, a challenging journey, but a good one.
And I love how you guys took advantage of your wife's opportunity to learn this and apply it to yourselves. Now, I also transitioned from long-term rentals to short-term rentals. I think that's, not uncommon. I'm curious for you, what were, for somebody else who's maybe considering that, what wisdom would you pass along right now?
Oh man, I walk into a lot of houses of people potential clients who, for one way or another, have already acquired the property. Whether that was because they purchased the property on their own, they didn't consult anyone, they just had kind of a realtor help them in that transaction, or because they inherited a home, and sometimes that's going to be a little bit easier than others, whether the person that they got the home from had debt on the property or not. But I walk into a lot of properties where post-acquisition, where the property is not to the standard that it needs to be competitive. And we're in a post-COVID world now where right after COVID, right at the tail end of it, it didn't really matter what kind of Airbnb you had, what kind of short-term rental you had. If it was an air mattress on the ground, you would do well. I remember when right after I launched my own personal Airbnb right after COVID, right at the tail end, and I launched that listing with no photos, literally with a coming soon photo. And I booked up that summer and could not believe it. But I was in the middle of reno. I was getting close to when my peak season was starting, and I just wanted to start getting some traction. And so it was literally just one photo coming soon. And that month, I think we did like 15 grand in that little 2-bedroom apartment. But I walk into a lot of these properties where they have not done a good job underwriting it. And so I have the unfortunate position sometimes where I have to tell people, hey, I don't think that this is going to be what you think it's going to be. Or you're going to have to put in a lot more money than what you thought. So I would say one is invite someone into that process that can pull the data for you. I think this idea of, well, I feel like it could be a good Airbnb, or I feel like this could be a good property for me, just in the way that the markets are saturated a little bit now. And obviously that's going to depend on what market you're in. But depending on the market you're in, this idea of like feeling, I feel like this is going to be good, is just, it's not enough anymore. You have to actually have the numbers, and you have to run the numbers conservatively. So I'll never give a prospect the actual true numbers that I think the property is going to do, or the goal revenue that I think that the property is going to do. I'm always going to be undercutting 10, 15, even sometimes 20% off that property, because I don't want them to be making financial decisions off of, these numbers that I think are accurate, because it's going to be more. I want them to be able to make some good decisions on lower numbers, so that, God forbid, if something bad happens, or the market tanks, or there's regulations that come in that then require minimum night stays or any kind of changes to that market, I want them to have a cushion to be able to adjust appropriately. And I just don't see a lot of people underwriting deals correctly. And so that would be my biggest encouragement, is make sure that you're actually running numbers. Make sure that you're actually pulling real data, and that the data that you're pulling is good data. And that's a whole other conversation of what is good data versus bad data. But be thorough in your underwriting, and make sure that, I think one of the other thing I would say too is one of the big trends that I think we're all seeing across the country, and I'll talk for the US specifically, is this idea that the way that you design a listing, you have to kind of have this mentality of, how do I make my house the destination itself? Another way of asking that would be, how do I make my house super Instagrammable, so that regardless of whether I have 400 competitors or 500 competitors, my listing stands out because people see it, they think, wow, that place is awesome, I want to go there. And when they're there, they want to take photos, they want to post on social media, so that because it's a cool place, it's a fun place, they feel like the value that they're getting is there, and then that you can try and get a little bit more viral traction that way. But the problem with that is that I see people spend all of their money on acquisition. They think that they need to get the biggest and the best house, and then they leave no money to be able to actually furnish the property appropriately. And so then they're looking at Craigslist, they're looking at Facebook Marketplace, they're going to their local, consignment store. And sometimes you can find good stuff, but to be really intentional and to design a really thoughtful, aesthetically pleasing property that has good amenities, that's going to be a struggle when you're doing it on a budget like that. And so I typically tell people, hey, you should plan for $4,000 per bedroom, $5,000 per, living room, common area. So don't spend all your money on the acquisition. I'd rather see people buy a smaller property and have more resources to be able to design and stage well, versus they get the biggest place and then you're struggling to get someone to buy books to go on the shelf, or fake plants or whatever it may be. Like they have no money, and then it's really tough to do it, and then it's really tough to stand out at that point.
When you're thinking of the design that would make something Instagrammable, what are you seeing the trends are right now, at least in your markets?
Yeah, so my market's interesting. In my market, which really kind of comprises 6 or 7 different towns, I'm basically smack dab in the middle. I have no more than a 30-minute drive to my furthest boundaries of my market.
And can you tell people what those towns or that region is so they can picture it?
Totally. Yep. So I am north of Boston on the North Shore. And so we manage in towns like Marblehead, Salem, Beverly, Manchester by the Sea, Gloucester, Rockport, Ipswich, Essex. It's kind of our triangular, all coastal towns north of Boston. And it's interesting, and because this is a traditional vacation market. However, it's not wildly, maybe it'll be after this comes out, it's not a wildly competitive market. You're going to have towns that have maybe 400 or so active listings in it, but when you compare that to markets like Orlando or Austin or some of these bigger cities, the competition pales in comparison to those markets. And so you have a lot of people in this area where they are owner operators. Their photos are clearly taken from an iPhone. They just threw in whatever they had laying in their basement. And so it's not a highly competitive market, where in some of these other markets, you have to be really strategic. So that's kind of for my market at least, that's kind of like my disclaimer of it's a weird market. Now, the big thing that I would say that I see across this market though is you have to be in some capacity, if you really want to thrive, some water component. So whether that's either you have really close proximity to the ocean, to a local beach that you can get, whether that's a walking distance or you can get a beach sticker for a car, or, this will come as no surprise, you have some component of water at the property itself, whether that's through a hot tub, or even a cold plunge, or if you have a pool. In my market, I have a property that I manage up in Rockport. In that entire market, there's probably about, I would say probably 350 or so active listings. There are only 2 properties in that entire town that have a pool. And so obviously that house right now is completely pushing against the booking data trends that every other town and every other property is feeling, where I have, and I'm going to have to adjust things for next year, but I have nearly 100% occupancy from May through September, which is very atypical when you look at booking trends right now across the country, where booking lead times are condensed, especially on some of these larger properties. And so you have very far out bookings because it's an amenity that is rare in that market. And so, you know, if you can find properties, or if there's ways to, when you're in the search process for a property, to be able to see what amenities, and this is data that you can pull off of AirDNA, this is data that you can just kind of anecdotally acquire just through looking at all the different listings in the market that you're looking at. If you can find, hey, there's only these amount of properties that have a hot tub, or I only noticed one property that has a pool. If you can figure out a way to be able to add something like that, it's probably going to be worth it for you in the long run. I would also argue to say, look at what is socially trending in our culture right now. So, you know, in this area, it's not going to be as possible because lot sizes are just much smaller. It's an old New England area. But we know that pickleball is massively trending across the country and potentially around the world. And so these properties, you know, Rob Abasol had a great post a couple months ago where he added a pickleball court to one of his properties, and he immediately saw an increase in the revenue that he was generating. And that revenue was over and above the investment that it took to add that pickleball to the property. And so I think, you know, looking at what are amenities in your market that are scarce, that people do seem to really want, while also looking at what is just culturally, what is a big thing right now? How can you take advantage of that?
Investing in a new market, but struggling to find the right agent? I get it. And I've built a network of investor-friendly real estate agents who understand what you need. Skip the guesswork and connect with the right agent today at adriennegreen.com/expert agent network. And I have the link for you in the show notes. Some great wisdom there. And the second part of like that Instagrammable story that I was wondering as you shared it, do you recommend that people have like Facebook pages or Instagram pages or social media presence for their house where they can get tagged in these posts, or what does that look like?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think what I would say is I think that's a great thing to do once you establish yourself. I think the problem that I see a lot of people do, and I'm guilty of this myself at times too, is the shiny object syndrome and trying to spread yourself really wide. And, you know, I don't know who I originally heard this from, but it's better to be, you know, a foot wide or an inch wide and a foot deep versus, you know, a foot wide and an inch deep. I would much rather see people from the very onset really prioritize having a really strong profile on Airbnb. And I say Airbnb just because, for me at least, that's where about 73% of my bookings come from, is Airbnb. 2024, 440 million bookings were made on that platform from 180 million users. That's going to be the highest trafficked place right now, right? And so I tell people, hey, I want to see you prioritize and master Airbnb first. Right. And then once you have your systems and operations really dialed in, and you have these built-in automations and you have your pricing dialed in, then let's start to think through how do we build a really attractive Instagram page so that we can start to drive direct bookings. I just think that the danger is people try and do a million different things and then they they unfortunately don't perform well in either of those. And
Oh, yeah.
there is a learning curve, right? There is a learning curve when it comes to hosting people. And so iron out the details, kind of figure that out first, and then spread yourself to kind of this direct booking, which is going to have in and of itself a whole other host of different challenges than trying to just book via Airbnb. And so
Right.
I think it's great. I would just hold off slightly unless you have a very, very, very unique property. I have one in my mind over, I believe it's in Ohio, where they built their listing. It's like a compound of various different Airbnbs. The one that I'm thinking of is built into the side of a cliff face, and it launched direct from day one. And I think, and don't quote me on this, but I think the last time I saw it, they said that they were directly booked out like 2 years in advance because it is such a unique property. Mm-hmm. And so unless you have like this really cool place that's really different, I would say, prioritize Airbnb, then let's go and start building out your direct booking site.
That makes sense. Talking about these unique characteristics or things like that, I'm curious because I imagine your market is very seasonal, like you've kind of hinted at, right? That summer season's going to be the bulk of the bookings. There's a lot of the US that's like that, right? Whether it's a beach market or it's a snow market, skiing market, seasonality I think is pretty prevalent in the short-term rental space. Would you recommend, or what are your thoughts on maybe like trying to maximize your peak season versus trying to elongate that season or get more bookings in the shoulder or the off season? Because those could be some different strategies, right? Like in your markets, a hot tub might be more geared toward getting the shoulder season or the off season versus, summer bookings up versus some other things you could do. I'm curious what you've seen do well on that kind of equation.
Yeah, it has ranged from year to year. So if you had asked me that question probably 2 years ago, I would say you should keep your listing open year round, because in this area, again, because it's so seasonal, you have this historical context of a lot of people who take their summer houses that they rent out as short-term rentals and they pivot them to winter rentals, or they pivot them to, in my area, there's a lot of colleges. In a 5 to 10 minute drive from my house, I'll drive past 4 different colleges, making up, a couple, probably 2,000 college students if I had to guess. And so you have a lot of these winter rentals or school year rentals. 2 years ago, I would say, hey, keep it as an Airbnb because you're going to capture, because of the decrease of supply at these times of year, the supply is decreasing at a greater rate than what the demand was decreasing at. And so even in off season, you would probably still do pretty well. Arguably better, especially if you were an owner operator versus having a management company come in. You probably would have done better than you would if you had thrown in a winter rental or a college student. Now, this year that's pivoted a little bit, but what we typically do is, I think a lot of it comes down to pricing and revenue management and understanding the data behind things. So again, this is an area where you have a ton of owner operators, and generally speaking, a lot of the people in this area just don't really know how to price things appropriately. They're not taking advantage of some of these data-driven pricing tools like Price Labs, for example, which is what we use. They're either doing fixed rates. So here's my winter weekday rate and here's my weekend winter rate. Or they're just keeping the same pricing that they have during the peak season and the shoulder season. There's no dynamic change to that whatsoever. And so when you come in there and you understand what is my market doing, what are my comps doing, and going in creatively to say, okay, I see what all this data is showing. I'm going to just slightly come down in my pricing. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I would say with that too is Airbnb will give you data. They will give you really helpful data that helps you understand what is actually happening with your listing. So if you're on your Airbnb account, you go over to your Insights tab, and then you find the data. It's going to show you your conversion rates on, and you can change the time frame that you're looking at for every listing that you have. And you can see, okay, here's the percent of time that I'm showing up on the first page. Here's the percent of time that I am having people who see my listing on the front page, who then click on my listing. And then when people get on my listing, it'll show you the conversion data for people being on my listing to clicking the book button. And then it'll show you the data of people who actually land on my checkout page who then don't actually book. And the reason I bring this up is because I think oftentimes people think that the reason that they're not getting bookings ultimately and 100% of the time is a pricing problem. And I strongly disagree with that. you can be priced significantly below what your market data average is. But if people don't like your photos, if people get to the checkout page, and this recently changed with the way that Airbnb just kind of restructured the way that they do their checkout page. But a couple months ago, you would see all the different fees. You would see the cleaning fee. You would see, if there was a quote unquote management fee on there, whatever, if that host had added on, you would see all of that. That all gets averaged out and added onto the daily rate now over the length of whatever that booking window is. But if people saw all these fees, they may have liked your listing. They may have liked the daily rate itself when they saw it on the search page. But then when they get to the checkout page, it's all of these different fees that then push them over the edge to say, I don't want to book this. And so each one of those different metrics tells a different story, and it's not always a pricing problem. You could have really great pricing. You could be showing up really well on the front page, but if your listing photos aren't very good and people aren't clicking on your listing, it doesn't really matter what you're priced at. And so keeping those things in tension of what's my pricing at, what's the data suggesting and the psychology behind that, I think these different things then help you overcome some of these slower times of the year. Now, I would still recommend you have to wade through that through the context of what is my risk tolerance? Do I have the tolerance to be able to go through different seasons of the year where maybe my revenue is low? Maybe my occupancy was low because it's just a hard time of year. Like for me, February and March are just tough months. And we have to really be digging into the data and tweaking things as much as we can. But it's a tough time of the year. And some people may not have the risk tolerance to be able to handle those drastic fluctuations between, a property in February doing $1,500 a month and that same property in July doing $14,000. That's a big range that they may not be able to handle. And if their mortgage is $4 or $5 grand, they're looking at that. If they haven't planned appropriately, if they've blown all the cash, that's a tough conversation to have. That's a tough time of the year. And so I think that's the kind of overarching frame that you also have to have when it comes to these off season. It might make sense. I have clients like this. They don't have the stomach for off season fluctuations, and that's totally okay. In those contexts, we'll put in a midterm rental, whether that's a travel nurse, or we'll find a winter rental, in which case you're very much operating like you would on a long-term rental perspective, where you're doing really thorough screening. You're checking references, you're checking income and verifying that, you're checking the housing records to make sure that they don't have any evictions, that kind of stuff. And so, there's different strategies there depending on how that person's wired and what they're comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of great wisdom that you're sharing there, Alex. And what's funny is, it's reminding me of, I travel full time. I'm mostly staying in, like Airbnbs or, short-term rentals. And right now we're looking at a place for the fall in Portugal. And I'm, from the consumer perspective, I'm seeing all the listings that make all the mistakes you're talking about, right? Like they're keeping their pricing at summer pricing, even in the off season, right? Mm-hmm. And you can see their calendar and you can see as soon as get to the end of August, they're empty because they haven't adjusted their pricing. I can see the listings like you've talked about with the photos, or maybe they've got that initial photo, but then you click on it, you go through and the design is not there. They, look like they've been, like you said, furnished from the local thrift store or something like that. And so I see that difference, and you're right. As a consumer, I don't book those and they're missing out. So I think everything you're saying is resonating as a consumer of the short-term rentals as well. I can see what you're saying there.
I think people are first and foremost going to be visual shoppers. And so if on a very basic level, you don't have good photos or your listing is designed poorly, you're not going to get the traction. You're not going to get traffic onto your listing. And then at that point, then it becomes a different conversation of dialing in your pricing, of dialing in some other strategies. But at the very basic level, you have to have good photos and you have to have a good design. Otherwise, it's just going to be a race to the bottom at that point.
Right. There's a lot that goes into it, from the design to the pricing to the management, everything. And you've shared a lot of that with us. So it is time for our closing questions. So let's get into them. First, what is your go-to tool for managing operations?
Easy answer. We would not be able to manage what we manage without Hospitable. Hospitable has been an absolute game changer for us. We've tried other property management softwares and ultimately ended up back at Hospitable because of how user-friendly it is. One thing I appreciate about them is they're really good at communication with their clients. They do town halls on a pretty frequent basis. The CEO himself is in the Hospitable Facebook group answering questions that people have. But I also think that they are on the cutting edge of always making improvements to their software, always adding new features, always trying to make the user experience that much better and freeing that person up to be able to have the time that they want to be able to enjoy with their friends, their family. They recently just added a dynamic pricing tool so that they can become this all-in-one, one-stop shop for all things short-term rentals. And I think that they're doing a really great job. They added a really dynamic, robust AI tool recently as well. And I think, again, like we would not be able to manage at the level that we're managing without Hospitable. I think it's a fantastic tool.
I am a happy Hospitable user as well, so I would second that. And then what is one piece of advice you would give to your younger self when you were starting out?
Yeah, I read Brandon Turner's The Book on Real Estate Investing, kind of like one of the real estate investing Bibles, if you will. And in that book, he talks very clearly about the 5 people that you have to have on your team. You have to have a really good lawyer. You have to have a good accountant. You have to have a good insurance agent, a good contractor. You have to have all these different, a good realtor. And when my wife and I were getting started, again, because this is a little bit of a mindset poverty mentality, I felt like I had to do everything. And this was both in the long-term rental space, as well as even through our first probably 2 years of the management company, we did everything ourselves. We managed our business up until 25 listings, just my wife and I. She handled ops. I did sales. I was the de facto handyman. I was mowing lawns for clients. We're just doing it all ourselves. And it wasn't until we just had this breaking point where we were like, this is far too much for us to manage. And this shift came when we actually hired our first virtual assistant. And we went, we hired 2. One of them was awesome. She's still with us. She's incredible. And then we went through a couple iterations of some different people that it didn't work out super well. But when we hired the VAs, it became very clear how much of a game changer it is to actually have team. And the value that they bring to the table far exceeds the cost associated with investing into that. And that has absolutely allowed us to scale to another level. And now we're kind of in that same place of, all right, we need to figure out this next bottleneck that we have and how a person would solve that bottleneck. But if I could go back, I would say, hey, don't be so slow to bring other people into this. It's gonna be worth it, and you'll be able to scale at a much more stress-free level and to a higher level faster. So that I would be slapping myself on the wrist for not hiring things out sooner.
Perfect. Great advice. And then finally, what is a book that has been transformational in your investing journey?
Yeah, I just referenced it. Brandon Turner's The Book on Real Estate Investing. That's what got me into all of this. It was the first book on real estate that I had read that coincided with just digging into all of his content on Bigger Pockets in the podcast. But that book has really been formative for me. I like how he makes it a lot more simple than I think what people think that real estate investing is. It doesn't have to be overly complicated. And he portrays it in very simple ways of, hey, here are the things I look for when I go into a house. Here's my napkin underwriting of, if this is what the mortgage is and this is what rental income is, I'm going to add 50% of the mortgage as expenses. That's my super basic underwriting. And I think that that has just, the way that he has simplified it in that book has made such a big difference for my overanalyzing brain. And so I've really appreciated that book.
Yeah, that's a great one. And he covers everything. It is not a tiny book, so people be prepared. It is, an A to Z introduction to real estate investing. You get your money's worth for it for sure. It covers everything, but it takes time.
It's awesome. Yeah, totally worth it. It's a great book.
Well, thank you for all of that, Alex. And then if people would like to learn more about you or connect after this, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Yeah, good question. So they can follow me on either my Instagram, which is just Alex Steeg, or if they want to follow me on or connect with me on LinkedIn, they can just search Alex Steeg and they'll find me on there as well. Those are probably the 2 best places right now.
Awesome. And we'll have those in the show notes as always. Well, what an amazing conversation here with Alex. If you loved today's episode, please take a moment to subscribe wherever you're listening and leave a review. Now, most importantly, what investor do you know who could benefit from hearing Alex's story? Right now, please go ahead and just text or email, shoot this over to them so they can take a listen as well. And then, as always, join me again next week for another episode of The Freedom Blueprint.